Welcome back to part 2. I think this is going to end up about 4 sections altogether because it is quite a long lecture. Okay, we've looked at the heart. Now we're going to talk about the cycle of the beating of the heart. Page 499. And I am trying to point out the pictures in the book and everything. I know students get very confused with the heart, and it's very important that you get the beginning information so you can understand some of the later information. So go through it carefully, go through these animations, which I'm not here. So the cycle of the heart. There is a beating of your heart, and you can feel it in your pulse, where the blood passes through and you feel that beat. And then there's nothing for a second. And that's actually a relaxation and contraction of the heart. Our heart actually relaxes between beats. And that phase is called diastole, which is the lower number in blood pressure. Systole is the contraction phase. So if we look at blood pressure, it's usually written 120 over 80. That's perfect blood pressure, 120 over 80. And that's what most people want, but not necessarily we have. Also, blood pressure changes during the day, what we're doing, stress levels. So all of those things can affect your heart. Now, this animation does show the different phases. The next graphic I have goes over some of that information. So here we have a picture showing how the beating of the heart occurs, or the contraction. When I say beating, it's contraction. So picture upper left, that's when the heart is relaxed. So remember, your heart has to take a break, and the blood won't go into the heart if it's not relaxed. Remember, I said it beats forcefully to get the blood out, but it's got to relax to let the blood in. So that is called diastole. That's the lower number on your blood pressure. Then when the contraction starts, it's forcing the blood. Here you see on number 2 that the atria contract first. And that's when the blood is forced into the ventricles. So it's not one big contraction of the heart all at the same time. It's a smooth process that starts at the top and works its way to the bottom of the heart to push it out. So you can see the atria contract is only 0.1 second. It's a very short time. And then systole follows quite rapidly after, when the ventricles contract. And that is when the blood is pumped out to the body. It is at that point that the heart again takes a break so the blood can flow in again. And this happens over and over and over. And that is your heart rate. And that's your pulse that you'll feel at your wrist. You can feel it in your carotid arteries, which go up to your head. This is called the cardiac cycle. And it's an important cycle to remember about. Now, what controls this heart rate? I mean, the brain does control parts of it, because obviously you know when you get stressed out, you feel your heart rate increase. That is actually part of an old historic system that our body developed way before we became humans. It's a stress response. And heart rate, eyes, the pupils closing down, your respiratory rate increasing, all of those are also stress. So stress follows the same cycle. Now, what the heart also, obviously is controlled in part by the brain, but the heart has its own pacemaker. And that is so important for the heart to control itself. if the heart is taken out of the body and you hold it in your hand, it continues to beat without the brain's influence. So the pacemaker of the heart, or it's also called the SA or sinoatrial node, it's located in the right atrium, and I have a slide coming up that's going to show it, and this animation also will show it. It sets the pace of the heart. The SA node is the main controller of the beating of the heart. And it's got very special muscle tissue that's built into the wall of the right atrium. The heart itself is cardiac muscle. And if you remember when we looked at slides several weeks ago, you looked at 3 different muscle types. You've got voluntary muscle, involuntary muscle, and cardiac muscle, which is only in the heart. It has the ability to conduct electricity and create it. So it is a little different than the voluntary muscle that you have that only works when you control it. So this animation is very important so you can get a sense of how the heart is controlled by this SA node. Well, you also have another node in the heart called the AV node, or atrioventricular node. Now, if you look at this picture, which is also on page 5100, the SA node is the pace setter of the heart. It sets the beating of your heart. At rest, 70 beats per minute, 80 beats per minute. You know, some people have heartbeats as low as 40 to 50. Those are people that most likely are highly physically trained, because the more you train your heart, the more efficient it beats. Remember, muscles can be efficient or inefficient. If you have an efficient heart, it's going to pump more blood with each beat and get the blood out to your muscles more effectively than a heart that hasn't been exercised. So the SA node sets the pace, and it spreads the electricity throughout the entire atrium. You can see there the arrows that are showing how the entire upper part of the heart gets the impulse that was generated from the SA node. It's an electrical beat. It's an electrical pulse of energy. The AV node now sets the more of the ventricle pulse. The AV node is sort of a backup node. Sometimes the SA node can have problems, so you need a backup system. And in actuality, any muscle in the heart can take over the beating of the heart, and that can lead to problems. If you looked at the video before, it talks about your electrical beats and having problems with them. You can have a problem when you have something called ventricular fibrillation. That means one of the sites in the ventricles got out of whack, wasn't following the SA node directions, and decides to start beating on its own. And then another section, another section. So you can have the entire ventricle beating all on its own. Obviously, the person's in severe distress, and if the heart doesn't get restarted or rebooted, dies. Now, you can also have an artificial pacemaker, as this picture is showing. Sometimes people's pacemakers have problems, like I was before, and they need to put an artificial pacemaker inside to generate the pulse, so that the pulse is at an efficient number. Now, the electrical pulse that is set up by the SA node and the AV node is actually picked up called an EKG or an ECG, electrocardiogram. More common, it's called ECG today. It used to be EKG more often. But that is where they put the electrodes around your heart and they measure the waves. And the waves are being created by the SA AV node down the ventricles. It's a wave of electricity in the heart that causes the heart, the muscle cells, to contract. So they're measuring that pulse. When you have a normal heart rhythm, that your EKG looks like this picture. And you get it is coordinated with diastole and systole. You don't need to know the G. You don't need to know the waves or what they're called or how they time with this. But I bet you can see that this pattern is repetitive with each beat of the heart. The SA initiates it 70 beats per second. And that's what the EKG will show when a person's heart is beating. Now another factor is the blood vessels that supply the heart itself. I'm not talking about the atrium or the ventricle that pumps the blood out to all the organs of the body. I'm talking about as an organ itself. It needs a blood supply. If the muscles of the heart do not get blood, you start to have a heart attack. And that happens when the arteries or coronary arteries, they're the blood vessels that supply the heart itself. You basically have coronary arteries. And they supply the front as well as the heart. So the picture on the left is the front of the heart, as if you were looking at the person. The one on the right is as if you were looking through the back of the person at the back of their heart. Remember, there's a front, a side, and a side of the heart. And you can look at the model in class, and you'll see that it looks comparable to this. It has a front and a back. And then we open it up and look at the inside of the heart, because that's what the organ does. It pumps the blood out to the rest of the body. The heart is the main pump. It is pushing the blood through the plumbing of your system, or the blood vessels, which are called arteries, veins, and capillaries. Now we start to look at this on page 501. The arteries are what take blood away from the heart. And if you remember, I mentioned that there's one artery that is low in oxygen, and that is the pulmonary, whereas every other artery that takes blood away from the heart is oxygenated. Veins bring blood to the heart. There is one vein that carries oxygenated blood to the left side of the heart, the pulmonary veins. So the two are the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein. Now the arteries and the veins are large blood vessels, look at in a minute, and the capillaries are the small blood vessels. They are very thin, they're not muscular, and they are where the exchange of oxygen, dioxide, and nutrients occur between the blood and the cells. So arteries are very forceful, very strong, powerful. And the force that the blood exerts or pushes against the blood vessels is your blood pressure. And the drive for the blood pressure is the heart. And that pushing the blood through the blood vessels. There is also the fact that the arteries are there too, and they assist the heart. Now, the pulse that you feel in the artery, and it's measuring the amount of blood that is being pushed through, and that's what you feel. When the heart beats, it pushes the blood, and you feel that with your fingers. So here is a picture showing an artery, capillary, and a vein. But there's a couple others in here I want to point out. And I also want to show you, you can see on the left the artery. Look how big it is. An aorta is huge. Now it's of smooth muscle, which is muscle you don't control. So you can see the connective tissue that holds muscle together, and the epithelium is just the tissue that lines the artery. And you can see the blood as it's coming from the heart. Then it exits the heart. Now start to follow and you'll see a blood vessel called an arteriole. That is still an artery, but it's a smaller artery. As the blood leaves arteries, it's got to go to smaller and smaller blood vessels so that it can get to being a capillary. You can't go from an artery to a capillary without having some smaller and smaller and smaller vessels that lead to the capillaries, which are 1 cell thick. If you look at the picture up at the top, it is showing you that it's made up of mostly epitissue, and it's 1 cell thick. And that is where oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients and vitamins and minerals do their exchange. Then it starts to turn blue, because now we're getting CO2 filling the blood vessels. And in turn, it has to go back to a vein. But again, a smaller venule work its way to the vein. You can compare the venule to an arteriole. It's the blood vessel that is smaller than the artery or the vein, but larger than a capillary. Blood exchange is not occurring in the venule. Now the vein takes the blood back up to the heart, and I want to point upper right. Look at the picture. You'll see a valve in the veins. Veins have to have valves in order to prevent backwashing of the blood. You got the veins are coming from the feet to go up to the heart. That is against gravity. So every time the heart relaxes during its beating process or diastole, the blood could go back down to the feet if you didn't have these valves preventing that. So when it relaxes during diastole, the valve shuts and the blood will not go back down.